and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. This is the 30th of April, Thursday in the year 2020. We are still in the coronavirus pandemic lockdown. And today we're going to take a look at part 3 of our examination of Brian Hales' submission asserting that the idea that Joseph Smith would retaliate against women who rejected his proposals was an example of a vicious lie in the Nauvoo Expositor. So if you haven't checked out part 1 and part 2, please do that because they're kind of essential to moving into this third discussion, and you can find links for it on the descriptions for the various videos. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into part 3. This is Defending the Expositor, Picking the Nits, a response to Brian Hales. Okay, so let's get going here. Getting everything signed up. Okay, and this is from back in 2015 is when this response was first written. Okay. When examining explanations and rationalizations put forth by someone, it's important to first examine the factual basis of their claims. This is what part 1 and 2 of the response of Brian Hales has done. In part 1, we reviewed the fact that the actual statement in the Expositor, which Hales referred to, was a reference to a warning given in the Revelation on plural marriage. In part 2, we reviewed each of the cases Hales provided and found that only 2 of the 5 showed a documented proposal, and saw that since those cases were kept secret, the statements of the Expositor would have been made in good faith if they implied what Hales suggests they do. An other important part of any examination is to look at the logic behind the explanations and rationalizations and see what is principally being argued. This involves examining the premises used and the underlying logic and implications of the rationalization. Hales asserts that this type of examination is nitpicky. However, this will be the focus of the final part of this response to Hales' submission. What are the premises? Hales' argument begins with this statement. Joseph Smith's offers of plural marriage were apparently turned down by several women. The historical record indicates that his preferred response to these rebuffs was to quietly let the matter rest. No evidence of retaliatory excommunications or other vengeful reactions have been found, although twice he sought to counteract allegations he considered untrue. That's the end of that part of Hales' quote. Now, the key point that Hales makes in his argument are these. Several women rejected Joseph. His preferred response was to let matters rest. There's no evidence of retaliation. He did counteract untrue allegations. Those are the 4 points. Now, Hales' starting premise here is that the main complaint against Joseph is that he would punish women for refusing his proposals. The remainder of Hales' argument addresses that premise, and since he was able to produce documentation of 2 cases wherein women rejected Joseph without reprisal, Hales would be justified in stating that he had conclusively proven his point. Looking closer. Is that premise correct? This is an important question here because if the main complaint of Joseph is something other than what he is defending here, then he could be said to have created a straw man argument. Hales is no stranger to this term. Hales' final response to the Van Allens included a helpful definition. Now, this is a definition provided by Brian Hales in one of his responses to another piece on polygamy. Hales states, "A straw man argument occurs when a writer portrays the opposition inaccurately and then proceeds to counter the inaccurate argument. Such polemics always destroy the straw man, but do little to advance understanding because they are not based upon true depictions." That's a quote from Brian C. Hales. The argument Hales brings forth with his supporting example of 5 women who reportedly harmlessly rejected Joseph is only valid if the Expositor and other critics asserted that Joseph would retaliate for rejection of his proposal of plural marriage and simply for that rejection. If the reality is different from that, then Hales has constructed a straw man for himself. As briefly mentioned in part 1, Hales has used the exact same argument and 5 examples to defend allegations made by John C. Bennett in his exposé, History of the Saints. In his presentation and Mormon Stories podcast discussion on the 12 myths regarding Joseph Smith's polygamy, he describes the relevant issue in myth number 11. Joseph Smith threatened to destroy the reputation of any woman that turned him down. You can see his slide here from that presentation. During the interview, Hales states that this is actually a quote from John Bennett's book, and you can see that at timestamp 1 hour and 25 minutes in that interview. Is this actually the case that Bennett made? Nowhere in Bennett's book is that phrase or a variant of it found. What is found are the following statements by Bennett and some of the women and men whose affidavits and letters Bennett included. This includes, quote, "This same scheme has been carried out in reference to Mrs. Pratt. She told on the impostor and was marked by him for destruction." That's on page 52. Another quote, "I shall approach her, for there is no harm in it, if she submits to be cloistered, and if her husband should never find out. And if she should expose me, as she did Bishop Knight, I will blast her character. So there is no material risk for so desirable a person." That's in a quote attributed to Joseph Smith from page 228. We have another quote also attributed to Joseph Smith from Bennett's expose. "Sister Pratt, I hope you will not expose me, for if I suffer, all must suffer. So do not expose me. Will you promise me that you will not do it?" Later, "If you should tell," said he, "I will ruin your reputation. Remember that. And as you have repulsed me, it becomes sin unless sacrifice is offered." That's from page 231 of History of the Saints. Another quote from page 250, "It is well understood that when any of those ladies who are insulted by Joe resents his insults and make an exposure of his baseness, he at once with his servile tools attempts to destroy their character." And finally, a quote from page 253, "He then told her that she must never tell of his propositions to her, for he had all influence in that place, and if she told, he would ruin her character, and she would be under necessity of leaving." That's from page 253. Now, those are examples of quotes from Bennett's expose. Now, in each instance, it is not the refusal of the proposal that is the determining factor of retribution. It is the public disclosure of the doctrine or proposal. There is a tremendous difference contained in that distinction, because it would allow a woman to refuse Joseph and not receive any retaliation unless she were to go public. Then Joseph would use his considerable influence in the community to defend his reputation at the cost of the woman's own good standing. This is the actual case that Bennett made against Joseph, that he threatened the women with retaliation if they publicly exposed him. Now, if Hales is going to respond to the actual charge laid against Joseph, he would need to provide examples which refute this particular assertion. Do the examples that Hales provides refute it? Hales acknowledges that all 5 of these rejections came and went unbeknownst to most Nauvooans. Since these are examples of women who kept Joseph's secret, then we would expect them to have received no retaliation according to Bennett's allegation. It was only women who ratted on Joseph who would have to face his reprisals. The example that Hales would need to provide in order to actually refute the charges of Bennett and the expositor would be women who had no consequences for publicly disclosing the fact of Joseph's teachings and proposals of plural marriage. All right, Bennett and the women who cried foul. If Joseph were to have proposed to a woman without any unethical or inappropriate constraints, and she were to turn him down, then he would have no cause to either call her a liar or insult her character if she were to tell her friends, family, or community that she had refused a proposal from him. Furthermore, if any of Joseph's associates were to insult her likewise, it would be consistent with the feelings of affection that drove his initial proposal for him to come to her defense. Was there ever a woman who made a public disclosure of Joseph's propositions who was not called a liar or worse? No. Did Joseph ever correct the record when his associates insulted those women and called them liars and prostitutes? Hardly. Joseph, and then we have a footnote here that refers to the prior article on indecent proposals. Hales provides a few examples of women who made public exposures and states that Joseph's response to them was defensive. Joseph Smith's interactions with 2 women, Sarah Pratt and Nancy Rigdon, demonstrate that he would defend himself against claims he considered to be false. Now, this is Hales making his case. It appears Joseph Smith proposed plural marriage to Nancy, who declined. While she did not publicly accuse the prophet, she also did not keep the episode secret. One account claimed that she, like a fool, had to go and blab it. Immediately thereafter, Joseph met with the Rigdons twice, and matters were satisfactorily adjusted between them, and there the matter ended. Now, let's see if looking closer at the story of these women supports Hales' description. For a review of the Nancy Rigdon affair, I will refer you to the relevant section in Indecent Proposals Part 1. The reality is that matters did not end there. As described in Part 1, a broadsheet commissioned by Joseph was subsequently published and widely circulated, containing an affidavit insulting Nancy's virtue. And while Joseph later stated that he did not authorize the affidavit's publication, he stopped short of denouncing or refuting its content. Because the prophet did not honorably come to her defense, rumors persisted that Nancy was involved in prostitution. The damage to Nancy's reputation was ongoing even past Joseph's death. This was evident in a speech given by Orson Hyde in 1845, while arguing against Sidney Rigdon's claim of succession after the death of Joseph. In the speech, Orson stated that Nancy Rigdon was then considered a poor, miserable girl in the very slough of prostitution. Hales is correct in saying that Joseph defended himself. He did so at the very expense of the woman he imposed himself upon. Hales does not explain what aspect of Nancy Rigdon's claims Joseph considered to be false. Sarah Pratt. For a review of the Sarah Pratt affair, I will refer you to the relevant section in Indecent Proposals Part 1. Hales states that even Sarah Pratt, who accused Joseph of making an improper proposal, did not accuse Joseph of threatening to damn her if she rejected. A review of the statements of Sarah Pratt, as given in Bennett's exposé, as well as after the fact, demonstrate that Hales' assertion is incorrect. Remember that Bennett's account includes the following. A quote from Joseph saying, "Sister Pratt, I hope you will not expose me, for if I suffer, all must suffer, so do not expose me. Will you promise not to do it?" And later, "If you should tell," said he, "I will ruin your reputation. Remember that. As you have repulsed me, it becomes sin unless sacrifice is offered." That's from page 231 of Bennett's exposé, History of the Saints. After leaving the church, years later, Sarah Pratt gave an additional recollection of the attempted proposal and made this statement. Quote, "If any woman, like me, opposed his wishes, he used to say, 'Be silent, or I shall ruin your character. My character must be sustained in the interest of the church.'" And that's from a quote from Mormon Portraits, an interview which included an interview with Sarah Pratt. Hales is clearly mistaken in stating that Sarah Pratt never made such an accusation. John C. Bennett. Hales goes on to restate his straw man argument about Bennett discussed above. Said Hales, "John C. Bennett accused the prophet of threatening to destroy the reputation of any woman who turned him down, but Bennett is not reliable and no one else made the claim." Now we've established that Hales is mistaken about no one else making the claim. We've just seen that Sarah Pratt made this claim in Weil's Mormon Portraits, independent of Bennett, and it corroborates the narrative Bennett included in his exposé. The preferred response. Now, part of Hales' argument is that Joseph's preferred response to women rejecting his proposals was to quietly let the matter rest, and I couldn't agree more. Joseph wanted quiet. The record shows that when the women were quiet, Joseph was quiet. But when the woman made noise, then Joseph no longer opted to let matters rest. In every instance where the prophet's proposal was refused and then made public, the woman was impugned. In every instance where the proposal was refused and kept secret, the woman was unmolested. This pattern completely supports the charges put forth in Bennett's exposé. Hales has actually helped make Bennett's case against the prophet all the more solid for pointing these 5 women out. A code of silence is usually either kept because of threat of force or danger to oneself, or being branded as a traitor or an outcast within the unit or organization. The invisible exception. Hales already observed that Well, starting again, having already observed that Hale's submission is entirely based upon a mischaracterization of the issue, or a strawman argument, it's important to look out for other rhetorical shortcomings. One of these is what I refer to as the invisible exception. This is where an encompassing claim is made, and then an exception is cited which would invalidate the encompassing nature of the claim, but it is disguised by minimizing language in the hopes that it is completely dismissed out of hand. This is one of the more brazen pitfalls because it provides its own contradiction and sounds authoritative unless you realize the contradiction and point it out. An example of this would be to say that Philip was a completely honest man, even though he showed creativity in reporting his taxes. Now, the last part of the sentence invalidates the first part if you understand what is actually meant by creativity. There is another famous invisible exception that every Mormon should be familiar with. When the Expositor was published by the Nauvoo City Council, when the Expositor was published, the Nauvoo City Council met. They deliberated and then voted to have the press destroyed. When the minutes of the meeting were reported in the newspaper, this is how the vote was described. And we can see a scan from that. The following resolution was then read and passed unanimously, with the exception of Councillor Warrington. Don't you love it when something is unanimous, except that it's not? Also, can you guess who the only non-church member of the council was? If you recall from a prior article, The Conflicted Men of the Nauvoo City Council, it was none other than Councillor Warrington. The insidious thing about the invisible exception is that it sort of tells you the truth. It includes the facts, but distorts or disguises them in a way that leads you to accept the initial conclusion. Hale's statement regarding Joseph's treatment of the women he proposed plural marriage to could be interpreted the same way. Regarding women who rejected Joseph, Hale states, "No evidence of retaliatory excommunications or other vengeful reactions have been found, although twice he sought to counteract allegations he considered untrue." Now, in the above sections and in the prior articles about indecent proposals, we've documented that Joseph's actions were significantly harmful to those women's reputation and may indeed be considered retaliatory. Hales does not point out exactly what Joseph felt to be untrue about the allegations. The women that Hales cites did not have retaliation precisely because they did not expose Joseph. Hale's statement is misleading because if the reader accepts Hales as his word, he doesn't look into the details of exactly what counteract allegations means and what Joseph did and allowed to be done to the women. Then they are likely to accept the first part of his statement, that there is no evidence. Invisible exceptions can be an effective way to smooth over controversial information. Hales has crafted a formidable structure to employ it. You could use a similar invisible exception to excuse or minimize any atrocious behavior. For example, we could do this in the case of Al Capone. No evidence of retaliatory shakedowns or other vengeful acts have been found, although twice Capone sought to assertively persuade some businessmen to pay up what he considered they owed him. Or Richard Nixon. No evidence of abuse of political power or other vengeful acts have been found, although twice Nixon sought to improve communications from people he considered his political foes. Or even Jeffrey Dahmer. No evidence of cannibalism or other vengeful acts have been found, although twice Dahmer sought to have dinner with people he had previously had conflicts with. Okay, in for a penny, in for a pound. We may as well do Hitler. No evidence of genocide or other vengeful acts have been found, although twice he sought to clean the genetic pool of traits he considered undesirable. Now, while these examples are ridiculous and will no doubt serve as a distraction for any response Hales may offer, they serve to point out that using such distorted logic and language to whitewash unpleasant realities is dishonest. While the second part of each of the phrases above is technically true, it serves to divert the attention of the reader from the real problem. No one would ever think that creating statements like these ridiculous examples could be an honest defense of these villains. George Orwell noted that such linguistic and logical acrobatics are primarily employed in defense of the indefensible. Joseph's actions on the question at hand are indefensible. And while Joseph is not a villain like these characters, the whitewashing that the invisible exception provides is no less effective or dishonest. Lucy Walker and tunnel vision. There is another rhetorical pitfall that Hales trips over in his defense of Joseph on this issue. In his discussion on the 12 myths of Joseph Smith's polygamy, Hales makes use of a quote from Lucy Walker Kimball, one of Joseph Smith's plural wives. Hales uses the statement to support the notion that women were free to accept or refuse the proposal, and he infers that this choice is made without threat or coercion. The quote is taken from an autobiographical sketch found in the church archives and quoted in a published text. The quote was, "A woman could have her choice. This was her privilege that could not be denied her." From Reminiscences of Latter-day Saints, a publication by Lyman Littlefield, found on page 46, and you can see it on archive.org. This quote in Hales' argument would seem very much to support his case. Hales is somewhat of a controversial figure among LDS historians and scholars. While his conclusions have both supporters and detractors, he is generally well regarded by all for the fact that he is committed to bringing sunlight to full documentation of Joseph's polygamy, even those who disagree with his opinions about their meaning. Collecting and compiling the tremendous volume of documentation is a Herculean task, and we've all benefited from Hales' work. His critics have sometimes accused him of tunnel vision or only using selected quotes which support his position and disregarding quotes from the same source which would defeat that argument. This quote by Lucy Walker Kimball is one which may serve as an example of that. If you read her full account from the original source and not just the quote that Hales provides, then you can see that while a woman would have her choice, you must remember that in Mormon doctrine of free agency, choices have consequences. If Joseph instructed her that a decision to refuse would mean that she would face negative, temporal, or eternal consequences, then the mere fact that she had a choice does not support Hales' position, since people who are threatened with destruction or damnation also still have a choice. After making that statement about a woman's choice, Lucy Walker goes on to describe the struggle that she had in accepting Joseph's teaching and proposal. This is her quote from that source. "In the year 1842, President Joseph Smith sought an interview with me and said, 'I have a message for you. I have been commanded of God to take another wife, and you are the woman.' My astonishment knew no bounds. This announcement was indeed a thunderbolt to me. He asked me if I believed him to be a prophet of God. 'I most assuredly do,' I replied. He fully explained to me the principle of plural or celestial marriage. He said this principle was again to be restored for the benefit of the human family." Going on later, she said, "He also said, this principle will yet be believed in and practiced by the righteous. I have no flattering words to offer. It is a command of God to you. I will give you until tomorrow to decide this matter. If you reject this message, the gate will be closed forever against you." This roused every drop of Scotch in my veins. For a few minutes I stood fearless before him and looked him in the eye. I felt at this moment that I was called to place myself upon the altar, a living sacrifice. And you can see the source of that and read it in its full context in her account on archive.org. Now, there are some important observations to make here. First, remember that Joseph was 37 years old in 1842 and Lucy Walker was 16. She testified in the Temple Lot case that after her mother died in 1842, she went to live with the prophet and his family, and she and her sister and two brothers were considered as members of the one family. If you examine her statement, it mentions that Joseph did actually tell her what consequence she would face upon refusal. The gate will be closed forever against you. What gate do you suppose he was referring to? Remember in part 1 that Lucy Walker swore under oath that the revelation from section 132 was exactly what was taught to her regarding plural marriage. It turns out that section 132 does describe the gate that Joseph is referring to. Quote, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, except ye abide my law, ye cannot attain unto this glory. For strait is the gate, and narrow the way that leadeth unto exaltation and continuation of the lives, and few there be that find it, because ye receive me not in the world, neither do ye know me. But if ye receive me in this world, then shall ye know me, and shall receive your exaltation. That where I am, ye shall be also." That's Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, verses 21 and 23. The gate refers to the pathway to exaltation. So Joseph, as mayor, prophet, president, lieutenant general, and her caregiver and benefactor, make this request of his young ward, who depends on him for her very living circumstances, and does so with all the self-proclaimed authority of God himself, and tells her if she refuses, that the gate to God's presence will be forever closed against you. Now, if you look at the broader context of the quote, you can see that the very example that Hales brings to exonerate Joseph actually proves the point he's arguing against. Now, Mormons are fond of saying, well, but she had her free agency, and this statement actually serves to absolve the authorities from any wrongdoing because, the argument goes, that if someone submits to something of their own free will, then it can't be considered coercive. That is utter nonsense. I've thoroughly explored the problems with that position on prior post on misinformed consent. How did she later describe the circumstances of her acceptance of the proposal? Well, in her deposition in the Temple Lot case, years later, she would describe the event in more dramatic terms. Question: can you state the circumstance under which he first taught you the principle? Answer, and this is Lucy Walker answering now. Well, the circumstances were these. It was a command from God for me to receive it, and I would rather have laid down my life than disobeyed it. But it was a grand and glorious principle that was to be established, and when I was called upon to step forward and gave myself, and when I was called upon, I stepped forward and gave myself up as a sacrifice to establish that principle. And I did that in the face of prejudice, of course. In this day and age, we are considered fanatics, of course, more or less. I gave myself up as a sacrifice, for it was not a love matter, so to speak, in our affairs, at least not on my part. It was not, but simply the giving up of myself as a sacrifice to establish that grand and glorious principle that God had revealed to the world. That's from the deposition of Lucy Walker Kimball, Temple Lot case, page 450, question 29. Now, it's very clear that she saw no other option. Exaltation to her was more important than life itself. Believing Joseph to be the very mouthpiece of God and hearing such dire warnings, how could she have refused him? To do so would be to sentence herself to eternal damnation, according to the prophet's own instruction now found in section 132. Hales confirms that her union with the prophet as a 16-year-old girl included full sexual consummation. She grew to accept the principle, as did others who were initially repulsed, since they were given to believe that it was essential and divinely ordained aspect of God's law from the prophet himself. What choice did they really have? Tunnel vision. Pot, meat, kettle? Anytime you point out a rhetorical shortcoming in somebody else, you had better be prepared to be accused of being guilty of the same thing. It's entirely likely that a response to my arguments here will be an exploration of some quote that I missed, which would appear to provide at least one example where Joseph's proposal didn't seem to carry the threat of damnation or reprisal. I too am guilty of tunnel vision. It's very hard to avoid. Confirmation bias is very hard to avoid, even when you try to guard against it. It turns out that such biases and rhetorical shortcomings don't necessarily invalidate your position. It depends on what your position actually is. Imagine that you are a doctor looking for evidence of lung cancer in your patient. The patient is really healthy. He works out. He's a great asset to his community. He's always helping widows and baking cookies for people. He's phenomenally wealthy. We really want to guard against cancer, though, because if we find any evidence of it at all, particularly if it's aggressive, it has very significant consequences. You could obtain a chest x-ray to look for evidence. On that x-ray, the overwhelming majority of the lung looks completely healthy. There's just this thing up at the top of the left lung, but let's not worry about that. The patient just seems so tremendously healthy and full of vigor that you show him the x-ray and just point out all the nice, healthy-looking lung. The patient sees the abnormality in the left upper lung and asks you about it, but you respond that other than that one region, all the other lung looks completely healthy. You invite him to go back to his routine and give it no more thought. Now, if you were the patient, would that type of tunnel vision be okay to you? Now, it is true that all the other lung looks really healthy, but does that matter? Is there a cancer up in the corner? I suggest that if you were the patient, the exact opposite would be true. Your tunnel vision would focus completely on the cancer in the left lung because it doesn't matter if the entire rest of the lung looks absolutely perfect. The fact that there is a cancer there means that there is a problem that needs to be addressed. If the doctor were to tell you, well, stop focusing on that little cancer and ignoring all the good, healthy lung. Get over your tunnel vision on that cancer, then I'm confident you would say that it's time for a new doctor. This principle is not just true in the realm of medicine. If you discover evidence of child abuse, you don't cite all the times that the abuser is kind to children as a reason to look the other way. If you discover a financial Ponzi scheme, you don't use the payments that are occasionally made to some investors as a defense of the perpetrator. If you catch a serial rapist, you don't cite all the non-coercive interactions that they've had with people every day as a reason to give them a pass. In all of these cases, what is considered tunnel vision is really just a focus on an impeachable offense. If the critical issues which attract tunnel vision in these examples are true, then none of the other aspects really matter. When Mormons look at other religions, they draw similar conclusions. There's no point for a Mormon to delve into the doctrinal minutiae of Scientology or the Church of Christ Scientists because they're not rooted in the proper authority, and so they're false from the get-go. Mormons would have tunnel vision on that fact, and it would impeach any other significant factor about them on the question of true religion. For a Mormon evaluating other religions, proper authority is a critical issue. Any rebuttals that focus on some niceness that Joseph showed to some person would be ineffective unless it can demonstrate that Joseph did not find it necessary to commit or tolerate the reprisals on somebody for publicly disclosing the fact of his plural marriage doctrine and proposals. Using tools to pick nits. In Hale's conclusion, he states, "Personally, I think this whole exercise is nitpicky. But someone referenced it, and so I've taken the time to respond. When it comes to Joseph Smith and plural marriage, I would also recommend that you read what the believers had to say, as well as the unbelievers. We wouldn't want to embrace a skewed view of what happened, would we? Both views are referenced in my book, and in my 3-volume series, Joseph Smith's Polygamy, Power, or History and Theology." All right. The whole exercise that Hale's referring to is that of trying to determine the truth. If the expositor did not lie in its allegations about Joseph Smith, then there are serious implications. It means that the church is being dishonest when it teaches primary children that the men who published it told vicious lies about Joseph. It means that the retaliation against those men, orchestrated by Joseph, was not an attempt to counteract allegations, but instead was an attempt to silence those who would tell the truth and expose his illegal activities which he had been lying to cover up. It means that church members today have to come to a more complex understanding of Joseph, which includes the realities of retaliation towards women, outright lies, and a God who would allow his divine laws to be acted in such a way. When you examine political propaganda, you have to be nitpicky. The lies, distortions, and obfuscations are designed to divert your attention away from unpleasant realities. If you accept them without critical assessment, then you are likely to find yourself tolerating or supporting things that you would otherwise be opposed to. This is true of religion as well. Other religions have their own nits. Jehovah's Witnesses reinterpret and falsify the original predictions of Charles T. Russell to maintain his image. Christian Scientists deny that Mary Baker Eddy derived her teachings from spiritual healer P.P. Quimby. These distortions paint a faith-promoting image of the founders of those faiths, keeping the members with a false, idealized view. Mormons wouldn't criticize members of those faiths for critically examining those issues. They would encourage them to pick away at those nits. The difficulty comes in seeing that the same strategies are being employed in order to maintain a faith-promoting illusion of the LDS founder and history. Why should members of those other faiths pick their nits, and yet Mormons should leave theirs alone, confident that the flecks and blemishes are nothing? Hales encourages people to read both the faith-promoting perspective as well as that of unbelievers. I have no difficulty agreeing with him on that point. When you examine those perspectives, I encourage you to apply the concept of steel tools and look out for the wood ones. That's a reference to rhetorical devices described in a prior blog post called Fix Your Faith Crisis with One easy trick or something like that. Steel tools are tools of study, and I forget what it actually stands for. Let's see what it says here. Seeking truth through education, erudition, and liberation. Wood tools are ways of overcoming a doubt. So wood tools are just rhetorical explanations whose only goal is to resolve your doubt, not actually to find truth. Steel tools are tools that actually have the discovery of truth as a goal. Okay, conclusion, final. In this three-part response to Brian Hales' submission, we've established that the actual claim made in the expositor was factually accurate and represented a reference to the warning included in section 132.4, which the authors of the expositor were familiar with and which women approached by Joseph confirmed matched their instruction by him. We further explored the 5 examples that Hales proposed as proof that Joseph was not retaliatory and showed that Hales' case was weaker than he could make it out to be, with only 2 of those 5 actually having a documented proposal. Furthermore, we demonstrated that the authors of the expositor could not have known about them, and so any claim in the expositor on that issue was made in good faith and hardly a vicious lie. Finally, in Part 3, we've examined the premises of Hales' argument and discovered that it's a straw man of the actual allegation against Joseph. The actual allegations made by John C. Bennett and other contemporaries is that he retaliated against women who rejected him and would publicly expose him, not simply women who said no. We have further examined his rhetorical pitfalls of tunnel vision and the invisible exception to illustrate some problems with the explanations and rationalizations used to defend the indefensible. I want to thank Hales for taking the time to consider the challenge and find a vicious lie in the expositor. If he's able to rebut the information presented in this response, I look forward to it. Doing the research to examine this and other possible lies in the expositor has provided a unique window for me to examine LDS history. Going into this issue, I was not certain that as strong a case against Hales' argument could be made as what the exploration of the context ultimately provided. If Hales continues to use these 5 women to defend Joseph on this point in the future, it's my hope that he would do so with an acknowledgement that there are legitimate reasons to see his treatment of the women who exposed him as retaliatory, and that the record shows that his proposals included a threat of such. All right. So that is the end of that article. I think that there were some comments in the article. Lindsay Van Allen, who had previously been responded to by Brian Hales, gave a positive comment. Let's see here. Anyway, so I'll invite you guys to go check out the comments on the article. There'll be a link in the description. So that is the conclusion of our examination of Brian Hales' argument in this case. So if you have some thoughts about what we've read or the entire subject of Joseph Smith's reprisals against women who would expose his proposals, then I invite you to call. The phone number is 210-422-2222. Let's see here. I've gotten a few calls inviting me to make shorter videos with more condensed bits of information. It's harder to do. I try to fit in what I can, and I'm not good at even my very faithful brother, who I always send some of my stuff to, he's like, John, I was jogging and your stuff is really funny. It's really good, but it needs to be shorter. I gotta help. I'm telling him if he keeps giving me advice, I'm gonna put a credit for him as the producer. He's like, no, don't do that. Anyway, okay, so let's see what comments that we have. We have Me Too saying, how dare any woman reject Joseph's proposals? The Lord will not be mocked. It's interesting, and it's kind of the essence of the type of proposal that is made, is particularly when you reflect on the nature of Lucy Walker's testimony that we read here. In making his proposal, she affirms that Joseph challenged her and said, I'm a prophet, aren't I? You believe I'm the prophet. And so he's using his status as prophet, as mouth person of God, as just a hammer on his 16-year-old foster daughter. to compel her to accept a proposal of plural marriage when, her dad's away on a mission, her mom died, she's completely at the mercy of Joseph. Defenders will say, well, she wasn't his foster daughter, she was a maid, she was getting employment in her house. Well, she lived there and she had no other place to live. And then she would testify that they considered her family and would travel with them. So it's just such a really imbalance of power that is integral to these proposals when you're talking particularly about these young women. But even in adult women, if you have people who are very religiously minded and you're the man who claims to be the prophet of God, and then you go to them with these unorthodox proposals and say it's a command from God, and then you include, as he did in the happiness letter written to Nancy Rigdon, the idea that even things that you would consider abominable in any other circumstance are somehow sublimated to righteous obedience when the prophet tells you that God commands it. And it's this divine command morality that is part of this relationship in polygamy that comes from sources that the church itself accepts, such as the happiness letter. That is so inherently immoral. Just think about it. If you see some crazy, long-bearded religious fanatic at the head of some group out in the middle of the wilderness, and they all consider him to be, the mouth person of God, and he secretly goes to the young women in the organization and says, God commands you to marry me so we can get it on. You'd look at that and you'd be like, that's a completely gross abuse of religious authority, and it's clearly designed to exploit vulnerable people for his own sexual gratification. Okay, well, let's change it then. Let's say that he goes to them and he says, well, in order for God to achieve his purposes, we've got to have a network of spiritual families all interwoven, and there's an important theological framework that this is in. Well, it's like, that's just religious sexual exploitation with more steps. It's the same thing. It just sounds nicer because it has more complexity to it, but the end result is the same. And that is a common defense that you'll see Brian Hales make, is that you can't look at Joseph's actions in polygamy simply as sexual gratification, because he has a complex, intricate, and beautiful theological construct behind it when we think about eternal families and the eternal family of God, and the necessity of these sealings to bind the whole, divine family together. It's a beautiful theological construct. It doesn't matter. The end result was he could enter into unorthodox relationships that gave him sexual access to other people. So if you want to share some of your thoughts on it, the phone number is 210-422-2222. Every time I cough or sneeze, I have to say Corona because it feels like it. But I think I just inhaled something today. Okay, so while we wait, we didn't get to finish our exploration of the the angel Corleone. Let's see here. If I go to another thing here and go into YouTube, we just got past the the foster children, and I think the next one deals with the Nancy Rigdon affair. And if you guys have followed my channel, you know that I really see Nancy Rigdon as a hero. She's just an amazing figure in this whole thing. Let's see if we can find it. Let's see. Partridge Sisters is at 527. So, all right. So let's see what we can do here. We'll remove this from the stream, and we will add the angelic conversations. All right. Let's see.
You're gonna have to marry these girls, Joe. Now I know. Side, you teach them the principle. You make them swear not to. They're gonna come around, Joe. I mean, what else are they gonna do? I mean, you're housing and feeding them, right? Hold on, Joe. What are you talking about? What are you talking? Okay. So you proposed to Sydney Rigdon's daughter, Nancy Rigdon, right? Okay, you told her about the principle, that she was gonna be your next wife. I'm sure she took it. What do you mean she didn't take it? What? She said no to you? The prophet? What did you tell her that God told you? Well, did you tell her that, if she doesn't accept, then more opportunities might be taken away from her? And if you told her and she didn't. Well, who does this girl think she is, Joe? What are we gonna do? We can't have girls willy-nilly saying no. You told her not to tell anyone, right? I mean, if she goes and blabs, and, then people won't accept you as a prophet, that's no good, Joe. That doesn't work for any of us. You're gonna have to go. What are we gonna do, Joe? I don't know. What are we gonna do? All right, this is it. All right, you're gonna write her a letter, Joe. Okay, this letter is gonna have to be the most pious and beautiful letter what you ever written. All right, you gotta start it out, and you gotta have the theme like, hey, this is all about making you happy. It's not about me. It's not about the prophet like getting his game on or whatever. It's about making her happy, right? And you remind her that the only reason we're here is to be happy. But there's some things you gotta do if you wanna be happy. You gotta do what you're told. You gotta do what the big guy says. And how do we know what the big guy says? Well, it's from prophets. Prophets like you, Joe. You gotta remind her, use the prophet, all right? You gotta remind her that you gotta do what the prophet says, or else, you can't be happy. Now, if you don't do what the prophet says, that's where the problem comes into play, right? You just gotta remind her of these things. She's gonna come around, Joe. Now, the other thing you gotta tell her, Joe, is you gotta tell her, these ladies, they get all uppity and they're all pious and they think they're so righteous. They're going to call everything that you try to do, wicked or iniquitous or whatever. Ooh, I don't want to marry some guy who's already secretly married, to a bunch of other women and just not telling his wife about, it's so unrighteous, it's adultery, whatever. Well, they don't understand how it works. The way it works is whatever God commands, that's what equals righteous. Like, if God commands it, equals righteous. Like, even stuff that they would think is, like, really disgusting and crap. Like genocide, slavery, all these things, murder. Like, you just gotta lay it out. You're like, if God doesn't command it, murder, bad. But if God, through a prophet, says, hey, we need somebody killed, we need somebody, snuffed out or whatever, then it's good. It's like righteous. It's like amazingly good. It's totally good. You just gotta smooth it over. And the best part of this is that once she sees that even murder will be excused as a prophet tells you to do it, well, then marrying you behind his wife's back, well, that's gonna seem like nothing. It's gonna be like, a walk in the park. It's gonna be amazing, Joe. She's gonna love it. Believe me, it'll work. You just, you get the letter, you send it her way, you sit back, and you wait for her to come to you. That's how it's gonna work, Joe. Trust me, I know. We got the handle on these things. Ain't no uppity, unruly children like Nancy. What is she, like 19 years old? She don't even have any experience in the world, Joe. I mean, she's been lapping at your feet her whole life, right? She knows you're the prophet. She's gonna fall in line. Don't worry, Joe. Forget about it. We got it good. All right, that's nice.
It's just, when you hear it said like in the mobster voice, it's just like, of course, this stuff is ridiculous. It's completely threatening. It's completely exploitative. It's like what we would expect a mobster to do. But, when you read the happiness letter, which Joseph wrote to Nancy Rigdon and was part of her whole, expose that led to her getting the very reprisals that Brian Hales is trying to make the case did not happen. When you read that letter, you can see that all of these aspects and elements are integral to that letter. The idea that something that is abominable would be excused and even considered righteous if you do it when a prophet commands you to do it. The idea that if you refuse the prophet, well, then you're going to have blessings denied to you. These are tacit and explicit threats that are being made. And so, you just have to kind of step back and realize that if you saw this coming from any other source, you would completely reject it and be like, yeah, this is ridiculous. It's terrible. But suddenly when it comes from Joseph, it seems to be okay. It's, it's even because the happiness letter is so revered because of its opening stanzas seeming to be so beautiful. It's about our happiness. It's about how God wants us all to be happy. Not a single church leader who's quoted that letter has gone on through the context of their talk to explain why this letter was written. And, when it says that you have to, that you can have happiness if you just but follow the path that leads to it, they don't explain to you what that path entails as depicted in this letter. So, it's crazy stuff. All right, so if you want to join the conversation, it is 210-422-2222. It's always great to hear from you guys because I can't just improvise and come up with stuff on my own. It's always better to have something to go off of. And it looks like we only have about 36 viewers right now, so we don't have too much people. All right, so let's see what comments that we have. We have Colleen Johnston asking if Lucy Walker ever came out of the zombie witch doctor spell. So if you watched part 2, one of the callers brought up the notion that it seems like people who suddenly start to make choices that are almost opposed to what you would think that they would do seem to be under some sort of zombie witch doctor spell. Other people use the phrase brainwashing. I mean, it's a very common thing for people to struggle with when we're dealing with family members who seem to be taken in by groups who are able to persuade them to believe things that totally change their life. There's a number of documentaries. I think it was a lot more popular in the 80s when the media seemed to have this fascination with the cults. And so you would find stories of family members who were lamenting the fact that they had a child who was in college and joined a group that turned out to be tied to some religious organization led by some charismatic person that caused the child to just abandon their prior identity and follow these guru leaders and seemed to be under their complete mind control. And I think mental health professionals who have dealt with this issue have started to formulate a language for understanding how that control happens and how it takes place. And if you want to be more versed in recognizing and being able to talk about these things, there's a number of books that are really good for your introduction. The guy who pioneered it is a guy named Robert J. Lifton. If you just Google his name, you'll see some descriptions of his work. There was one, his initial study was of the Chinese Revolution and how it seemed to take over their nation with their dear leader being the center of their thing. And it points to that this type of what we see as mind control is not confined to religion. You can find it in political movements. You can find it in even family or individual interpersonal dynamics. An abusive narcissistic relationship is just a microcosm of that type of thing. All right, let's see here. Steve Hassan has a series of books called I can't remember the title of it, but if you just Google Steve Hassan, he was somebody who was taken in by the Moonies and escaped that and actually eventually met with Robert J. Lifton, who encouraged him to continue his work in trying to create a movement and a body of resources for people struggling with trying to rescue families from these groups that seem to overwhelm and overtake them. And when the group is a small faction that is doing really, really weird things, it's very easy to identify them as having this type of undue influence and totalistic control over people. But when it's cleaned up and widespread, it's a lot harder to recognize the harm that can come from it. And that's where things like the Jehovah's Witnesses have way more members than Mormons do, and they're worldwide. And so it may be harder to identify them as one of these groups that exerts undue influence. But when you see the type of messaging that define that type of influence, using phobia induction, using black and white thinking, us versus them, using principles of doctrine over self, and blame shifting, all of these different things that you can learn about as you read about it, you start to identify them. And when you see them as a part of an institution and how it relates to its members, then you start to see why it's unhealthy. And people who, from the Mormon perspective, go on the journey about learning those principles can't avoid but see it being employed by the leaders of the Mormon Church. Every time that they invoke, how you have to interact with apostates, then you start to see that type of thinking. Whenever they tell you that some sources of information are safe and others are not, then you start to see parallels with the type of information control that happens in there. When they start talking about you as the chosen generation and draw a line between you and the secular world as some sort of existential battle, these are the types of narratives that go into that type of undue influence. So, all right, so let's see what here. Does Hales ever address the deaths of the handcart pioneers, especially the children? I don't think Hales does. He's really kept his focus on the issue of polygamy. And he did, in the past year or so, branch out from polygamy to try to make an argument in support of the Book of Mormon by basically challenging someone to come up with with some precedent of somebody creating a book in the way that he believes Joseph Smith did, that matches it in complexity and nuance and religious depth and texture. And that's kind of been his focus since then. And even when myself and others have tried to continue to engage him on his prior defenses of polygamy, he seems to try to divert the conversation back to this new question of, well, can you explain the origin of the Book of Mormon, when they're two separate issues. But I think from the Mormon perspective, they seem to be the same issue, because if you can't provide a naturalistic explanation for the Book of Mormon, then the Book of Mormon must be true. Then Joseph's prophetic calling is real, his power is real, and so anything that he did in polygamy comes from God and can be defended on that grounds. And it's a little bit of a circuitous way to go about defending polygamy, but that seems to be where he is right now. All right. Vanessa Braga says, I think Joseph went after married women because if they got pregnant by him, they already had husbands to take care of the kids, and Joseph wouldn't have to support him. I've heard that rationale before, not just in the context of Joseph, but even in other men of influence who have taken on mistresses or extramarital dalliances, that it was easier and more convenient to do so with a married woman, because if she got pregnant, there's already an explanation. She's already in a relationship, and it doesn't immediately point to something untoward going on. That I think people maybe would rely on that argument back when there was a stronger feeling that there were children and progeny of Joseph Smith who just haven't been discovered yet. In the case of Sylvia Lyons, I believe there was a DNA test a couple years ago, and it was decided based on that finding that somebody that everyone thought was probably a biological child of Joseph Smith through a plural marriage was not. And so people have kind of stepped away from that. There's one researcher, Don Bradley, who worked with Brian Hales, who has made a cryptic announcement in the Mormon Historian Facebook group about a year ago that he found somebody else who he believes is a biological offspring of Joseph Smith through a plural marriage. And he said more details yet to come, but we don't have anything from him as of yet. Don Bradley had been working on his own book, talking about what we can say about the lost 116 pages, and I encourage you to check that out if that's one of your areas of interest. All right, well, I think without any calls, we'll cover the last of our angelic conversations and then close it down. Let's take a look at what our angel has to say here.
I don't know what the problem is, Joe. I've been coming and talking to you a few times now, telling you that you need to start marrying these women, and nothing's happening, Joe. What's the deal? Well, don't tell me that Emma is protesting or Emma wouldn't like it or whatever. We already told you, all right? If Emma is not going to approve, you do it anyway, she's going to be destroyed, Joe. You don't even have to worry about her, like, in the afterlife and whatnot. All right? She's going to be destroyed. You're good. Joe, we need you to get the ball rolling on this, Joe. I mean, what are you doing? You're just sitting around. You're not even pursuing these women like you've been looking for the cute ones, right? I mean, when you're going out on your carriage ride, look around. When you see one and, it hits you right here or there or anywhere or whatever, you just find some time to be alone with them. You lay it out. They're going to accept it, Joe. You're the prophet, right? Don't tell me you're not going to do it, Joe. Don't make me use this.
The sword doesn't come out to the very end. All right, well, one last call for calls, 210-422-2222. If nobody calls, then we'll go ahead and close it down at that. There was a lot of reference in this response to Brian Hales to the couple of articles that he was responding to, the Indecent Proposals articles. And I've gotten a couple of requests to go over those stories, so we may go ahead and cover those. I probably should have done it first, but I was too eager to get to addressing the Brian Hales arguments because of some of the stuff that we had done previously. But with that said, we're right at the hour mark, so we'll go ahead and close it down here. Thanks for watching, and this has been Talk on Things and Stuff.